Yes. Hello, and welcome to the Lunch Zone, where today we are playing RAD, and we have several people here, one of whom is off screen. Thomas Malaby returns with a somewhat muted voice, so we will see how often he contributes without losing the rest of it. I am Nathan Humple. I am a metadata librarian here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
And I'm Matthew Carricker, a PhD student here in the anthropology department. And we acknowledge that in Milwaukee we live and work on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shore of Michigamme, part of North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present.
Alright, we are going to start. Here's a intro with the story.
The first apocalypse wasn't much of a surprise. I mean, from what I hear, the ancients kind of had it coming. When the MX-1s came and spread the fallout, most things were toast. But after that is when things got really weird. By the time the second apocalypse came around, we were totally like, seriously? At least, that's what the Elder tells us. The vendors meant well, but something went wrong with all those machines. Like, really wrong. They just, poof, disappeared, and left things worse than before they started. And I guess that just leaves us, the survivors. We live in the now, because we don't know if there will be a tomorrow. At least we have each other.
So, okay, this obviously apes a lot of 80s aesthetic.
Yes.
And it does it really quite well. Even the narration is very much this sort of like 80s, I don't know, like, what is it called? Goonies type thing.
All right, so like Big Trouble in Little Chinatown, or the Goonies, or Karate Kid.
Yeah, I would say that too.
You guys ever watch Shogun Assassin?
I have not, no.
That's an interesting. So it was an 80s release, but they took 4 or 5 Japanese samurai films and turned them into one, and then dubbed it.
Oh,
And
interesting.
gave it a crazy synth soundtrack. But it also has a sort of like the child narrator in the start.
Okay, so you are tasked with going into these outlands to, I don't know, whatever, and and you need to, as you go along, you'll get radiation points, and those will mutate you into different things.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's a roguelike. So the landscape changes each time.
Right, but built on the same gameplay principles each time.
Yes.
So that you can master the principles, but not the level layout. Cool. Well, I see the art style reminds me of
Remediation.
the use of the cassette tape and the floppy disk as a form of remediation of physical objects being digitally represented.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. That's true. I think it's interesting to have this pastiche of, and even in the game, it's really a pastiche of 80s, because within the game world, you're not from the 80s necessarily. I'm not sure why the apocalypse has taken on this retro futuristic aesthetic and demeanor, but it has. Okay.
Well, much like Fallout does with the Atomic 50s.
Yeah.
I was going to say I wouldn't call it a rotor-scoped art style, but you see this sort of idea that, it's sort of like drawn over the graphics.
Yes.
In
yeah.
the same way as
Well,
I can't remember the name of the series that does that more explicitly. It'll come to me.
It's a bit like cell shading.
Yeah. It's kind of like cell shading. That's what I was gonna say.
Let me see. I have Steam on here. Oh no, I got rid of it. Oh well.
So the cassette tapes are money, a form of money, and I believe the floppy disks are like a key.
Okay.
I think it's interesting to note that I think the style is, if we want to get more fine-grained about it, late 80s, very early 90s, right?
Sure.
That's when these colors and this look, I think of like the jackets, the colorful jackets and the sunglasses and the crazy colors and the neon. That's when that was a big deal. Neon
That's
colors.
true.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, when we think about an 80s aesthetic, that's kind of often what's represented.
It was often identified with California, I would say, with films that were set in California, with a kind of mall culture.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
definitely.
I think of Valley Girl kind of idea, like the Nicolas Cage movie. And it reminds me of, strangely, of a, maybe it's the post-apocalyptic quality to it. Reminds me of a somewhat obscure movie. I think it was called Night of the Comet.
Okay.
Which was a kind of, there's been a disaster and now there are zombies. And the people surviving are all these teenager, types with the quintessential Valley Girl amongst them,
Yeah, there was a lot of movies in the 80s that sort of took that child empowerment thing. Well, I mean, and that's sort of in the 50s too.
E.T., Stranger Things itself is a kind of revisiting that idea.
Sure.
Kind of. Oops.
And how does that, the specific, I'm thinking about the ways in which like new waves of technology empower the youth to sort of take on the the apocalyptic or the existential crises that are facing society. For example, the ozone layer thing would have been a big thing, at this time, or these kinds of...
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And the function that... I'm trying to think about the Goonies, actually, and the kinds of technology that appeared and how it aided the function of finding the treasure,
Well, there was a lot of like inventions in that one, and I think that became sort of if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah. Tinkering.
And that like the kids invented things, and that's you still find that, and I find it really funny because it's interesting in like kids media now that you have these like this sort of thing where there's like the kids will build like a robot with complete AI, and it's like, why is this a thing?
I think that in not just in media studies, but in the social sciences in general, we almost never incorporate, as much as we should, generational tension, right? Generational difference. What we know about these kind of, generally speaking, eternal dynamics of how older generations and younger generations relate to each other. There's no question that in the 70s and 80s, that tension manifested itself around the access to new technologies and mastery of new technologies. There's a book that I'm teaching right now in my course on American Masculinities by Carly Kukurik called Coin-Operated Americans, Rebooting Boyhood at the Video Game Arcade. And it's looking at the 70s and 80s with a very similar set of ideas, like new technologies are coming, the new generation understands them in a kind of practical way, to an extent that older generations don't even have a prayer to do, right? So there's war games, or Back to the Future, for all those things, the younger generation are the ones who should have access to new technologies. It's a techno-liberal notion too in itself. Institutions shouldn't have access. It should be these young, individual, clever
Dreamers.
right.
Yeah.
The new, the novel, who will then come up with the clever solutions, and like a gamer, have this kind of creativity that comes with that position, that generational position.
Well, and you definitely see that in the '90s too, with these, the hacker movies. With
Yes.
I love those. Yeah. But to go back to the mall culture idea and about the distinctive and not garish, but a style with a dominant theme, right? A sort of cobbling together, a tinkering.
Postmodern kind of style, I think people would often call it.
Totally.
Yeah.
And how that relates to the consumer infrastructure of the shopping mall, right? As a place where, you can go to this store to get a bracelet, you can go to that store to get a t-shirt,
Right.
and it's all about what drives you on that flow through the thing. Is the important part.
Absolutely, and it was kind of stridently uncaring about history at the time. So there was a school of design called the Memphis School of Design, and if you look it up, you'll see that it's all that stuff that looks very late 80s, early 90s. It's all the bright colors, the geometric forms, all in interior design. And it bespeaks that era where, we're doing new stuff. There's no history to design that we need to think carefully about. There's a bunch of new colors, new forms available, and those are the ratios and relationships we're interested in.
Supposed to do a 720. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it. There we go.
Hey, nice. So
You
there's
fed me all the
that's
tapes.
the skater thing.
Yeah.
The skateboarder thing.
Well, I might be talking out my butt here, but that contrasts to sort of a breakaway from what happened earlier in the 70s, where you had a lot of naturalist movements which were looking to locate their
Yes.
design or their philosophies within an idea of an ancient or
Or at least local material, since like in the Danish modern, Scandinavian modern, it's all these natural materials. They're modern.
right.
The lines are modern, but they're not abandoning stone,
Totally.
wood grain, all those things. Yeah, for sure. And that was very 70s.
So to bring it back to the text,
Yeah.
Well, that's all part of it, I think.
Well, and now it's this kind of nostalgic, encounter, ironically, with something, a period of time that was, stridently a nostalgic.
yeah. I listened to that. Are you hearing that sort of like that synth horn?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the soundtrack is very... I would definitely say Double Fine has their problems with gameplay and a lot of other things, but they always nail the aesthetic really well, and whatever they're going for, and this is definitely an example of that.
It's interesting that there's a kind of fungal trope
Yeah.
to all these colors.
Well,
that-
I think you're also supposed to be... I was expecting... I played the intro, but I was also expecting there's a small sort of introduction to what you should be doing here and why you're going out into wastelands, and I guess I didn't do that. I don't know why, but at any rate,
it's an interesting move itself to kind of refuse the framing.
well,
Right?
I think
the narrative framing.
yeah, I think what it was that this is using an older save game that I had. But anyway, I think you're supposed to be like restoring the wastelands by introducing the organic material back into it. But as you do that, you'll be exposed to radiation and you'll mutate. So you're supposed to be, it's kind of like a sacrificial thing where, oh no! Oops. There we go.
And of course, I see that things like the police car wreckage are maybe procedurally generated recurring
Yeah.
assets. But then, you know, you have this sort of... I suppose that's sort of like nuclear goop.
Yeah,
in the
and that'll
cooling.
damage you.
Well, you know, as you know, people like Pete Sands here at UWM, who's an English professor, and he writes about utopia and dystopia. There's a way in which anthropology has struggled to write about people's imagination of the future. What will the future be like? But every social actor is always acting with some more or less well-formed guess or picture about what the future holds, right?
Sure.
And I think with respect to these kind of post-apocalyptic games, it's always interesting to consider what is the story about how renewal happens. Is renewal fungus? Or is fungus the wrong renewal? And we want a different kind, we want a return, right? Well, what constitutes renewal can never be going back to what it was. So in this game, it seems like the fungus metaphor is a sign that something has gone wrong, which is an interesting idea, right? That they're alien or they are contrary to human living, right? I think that's interesting to think about.
Well, think about how fungus offends against notions of order.
Yeah, that's very Mary Douglas, you know, in that idea, right? It's impure, right? Whereas you can have, people play in D&D, a cleric of the grave, and they're all about fungus.
Right,
Because
totally.
they see it as part of a natural cycle of death and renewal, right?
Sure.
Well, and the game we played a couple weeks ago, Cana and the Virgin Spirits, the rot is what you... I don't know if you watched that run, but there's an entity that you sort of gather called the rot. And the rot is a good force that is...
Yes.
that allows you to... The forest to... and actually the people just in general to renew themselves. The
Right.
cycle to renew itself.
Right.
Yeah, that was an interesting game, and it was actually before we'd covered Mary Douglas in the theory course I'm taking. But you have this sort of notion of the pristine forest, and then you have the element of the rot, which is not the opposite of the forest, but a part of its cycle. And then you have the character who's trying to mediate other characters' experience of... your character's trying to order other characters' experience of loss and decay and renewal.
Right.
For example, we had the small forest boys who were looking for their brother who was lost. Turns out that he had died, and so your role as a mediator was to sort of like help them resolve
Right.
the fact that he
Which is-
died in the wrong way or whatever.
Which is a kind of post-coloniality, right? To refuse the narrative that says, with modernity and colonialism, no, we can perfectly order things. And here's the stuff that's other, here's the stuff that's wrong, that we're going to refuse. We're going to refuse fungus, and all these things, versus rot, right? Versus a contrary claim that says, no, everything cannot necessarily be fully rationally ordered in that way. You need to, include the kind of different way of operating, a different way of living.
And so, with regard to the retrofuturism,
Yeah.
and the idea of like a hauntology of sort of like futures which never came to be,
Right.
I guess an analytic move with games like this is to say that, well, how did these games represent our present? Because, this is, assuming in the late 80s, 90s the world ended, and then there was a second apocalypse or whatever, then could we presume that this game takes place parallel to our present? And if so, what parallels are we supposed to draw between
Right.
the game and our present? As
Yeah.
this sort of is saying, this game sort of saying in the way that our society maybe hasn't, because it's reinvented itself and maybe erased a lot of the culture or society of that time. It's saying, no, this was a world that existed that still is out there, or is still there in the way that...
Still imaginable.
That's right. I'm thinking about the sort of the, what would you call it, the sedimentary nature of futures as well. You got these stacked TVs and stuff or whatever.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
It's like the future is never just all flying cars.
Yeah.
Like our engagement with the future technologies here, you've always got a little bit of the old, a little bit of the, somebody's house isn't all future, but you might have one Alexa, next to a stereo, next to an 8-track.
Yeah.
But then thinking about these sorts of generational eras as distinct, right, as stacked next to each other, rather than all mixing into one another.
Right.
In a way, the purity and order of genre or era. Like we think of, for example, the 70s as a distinct thing. We think of the 80s as a distinct thing, so to pollute these sorts of things and bring them together, it's interesting to think of aesthetic pollution.
Transgress, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think retrofuturism at its core is also somewhat nostalgic, because it recognizes this this notion that, or this there is sort of, like you said, there's this sort of lost hope of like what the future would be. It's also like necessarily what's the word I want to use? It's like necessarily I don't know. What I was trying to say was that it has I guess pastiche is a sort of word. It has an artificiality to it that science fiction sometimes allows itself to not have. So you have science fiction that's trying to say, okay, well, these are the things that are happening now, and so in the future that will lead to this. Whereas that retrofuturism is like, I don't really care about that.
Right.
So we'll just ignore that that part of science fiction, and just go back to this these notions that informed the.
Is it fair to say, Nathan, that you're kind of talking about the way in which some science fiction, often classic science fiction, has a kind of earnestness to it? That we're supposed to learn something from it.
Yeah.
Our imagination is supposed to inform our concrete action to the way it expands our imagination.
Yeah, I guess.
Versus a kind of more, we can call it playful, right? Less earnest, sort of less directed, less scripted maybe, kind of playing around with a set of elements. Right?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's much more playful. It doesn't have this sort of obligation of having this necessarily obvious message, and that coincides with the move towards postmodernism and really everything. I mean, it's hard to separate what postmodernism did or didn't do from anything in media at this point.
Right.
One of the things in the game design which complement that idea of a kind of playground is the idea that because the map is, you said, generate differently every time, it reduces the value of the environment as being important for kind of storytelling or a larger point, because the environment's always being recycled, the same elements in different spatial variations. It repositions where our focus is supposed to be, away from a correct way to engage with the environment and towards other sorts of, gameplay.
Yeah, playful recombinations, kind of.
I was thinking about, to your point about before, about a discussion that David Graeber had in a couple of places about being a child of the 60s and growing up with a very distinct idea of what the 21st century was going to be, you know,
Right.
like thinking, well, everybody's going to have flying cars. Nobody's going to have to work so much. In bullshit jobs, that's the jumping off point. In The Joys of Bureaucracy, he has an essay about why we don't have jetpacks yet, and about the ideological commitments of technology. And what's interesting then for me about retro future apocalypse stories is the idea that, I mean, you could use the Marxist notion of commodity fetishism here, right? In the ways that certain styles, certain products, certain aesthetics make promises which they really have no authority to do so, right? About what you're going to become when you use them, what the world is leading to, and what really... And then, of course, the ultimate apocalyptic fact about it is that how quickly all of those claims and promises are undermined as soon as the market for these objects saturates and capitalism has to reinvent a new era, a new distinctive zeitgeist for everybody to sort of consume, not just in the material sense, but like you were saying, in a future disposed promissory kind of thing.
Right, yeah. There's a kind of, it must find the, refashion a new future, which operates in a way like a cycle of fashion, right?
Yes.
Which fuels consumerism.
And where do these fashions go?
Right.
Well, they become retro future apocalyptic
That's right.
games. You know?
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
I guess I'm ready to comment upon this because of how long I spent playing the Fallout game.
Well, I was going to mention that because that definitely plays on the retrofuturism. It's interesting with the Fallout games because I think, a lot of these games... Okay. A lot of these games... I always find it interesting that the games have to justify why there's this retrofuturism aesthetic. What is this? I thought
so many verbal puns in what people are talking about. Cartoons and transmission. The transmission is coming.
Well, it's a post-apocalyptic cargo cult culture.
Yeah, right.
Car
Seems
hyphen go culture, where...
Rather Ampere. Yeah, very cyberpunk. Or what would it be if it's transistor punk almost, right? It's that era. The radio era, the era
sorry.
of Heathkit, right? Does everybody know what Heathkit was?
it's a character in Wuthering Heights.
Heathkit was a company in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where they would ship you a radio or a television in parts.
Oh.
I mean, parts. Like all the soldering remains to be done on every board in it.
Interesting.
And I grew up in a household where I did not watch any TV, any television on a TV we hadn't built until I was in college.
It's fascinating.
So that was that kind of post-World War II DIY,
Yeah.
And I'm picking that up here, that era where, hey, I am someone who knows what the difference between a transistor and a capacitor kind of thing.
And that's one of the leitmotifs that we sort of picked up a little bit before with the Goonies and tinkering and
Yes,
this
that's
sort of
true.
thing, right?
Sure, that was the kind of late tinkering in retrospect, right? Because a lot of that stuff has been recaptured now by institutions through the digital network that makes it harder for us to jailbreak our iPhones or whatever.
Totally. Everything went onto chips
Yeah.
or microchips.
Well,
Yeah, and you find that with cars too, which there is that aspect of masculinity that has that tinkering quality to it.
Right.
Whoops! What the heck just happened? But that's kind of been removed.
Yep. Yeah. I was interviewed for a BBC program for an episode called Broken, and they used my interview to frame a lot of these stories about how we don't get to break things anymore.
When was this?
That was 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
All right.
It was for Alex Krotowski's BBC BBC program The Digital Human
Oh yeah, okay.
on BBC 4, I think.
Well, Steve Wozniak's just come out in the news a couple of weeks ago. Didn't we to see this about the right to repair?
Yeah.
It's all connected, right?
Yeah. Because it's such a big part of the kinds of literacies that people develop during their formative years, right?
Right.
When you don't allow people to understand the materiality of the digital,
Right.
then it's because the literacies they have come out of the practice of, or rather not having the practice of tinkering behind the scenes.
That's right.
Knowing that if you do this, that happens, that playful feedback with the trial and error and everything.
It's also a way of demonstrating that oligarchies in capitalism are actually hostile to the free market. The free market is too volatile, too creative. We shouldn't be engaging in a classic market exchange where people buy something and they own it and can play with it.
Right, yeah.
So we need a different way of sustaining our capital position, which in fact reduces the property rights of the people sending us money. They're no longer really buying anything from us, they're subscribing.
Well, they're licensing. I mean,
They're
that's such a
licensing,
huge
exactly.
thing with digital.
Yeah. It's a way of demonstrating that, we shouldn't mistake the volatility of the free market as always aligned with the established interests of capital, right?
Right, of course.
That's why monopolies exist. Why, or not just monopolies, that's why, I can't remember the word, but a bunch of companies will get together and price fix
Sure.
because they don't want the volatility of the market. They would rather
Yeah,
give up
reassuring.
any potential market advantage for a consistent, predictive flow of capital. It's famously in the Archer Daniels Midland case where they made the movie The Informant about that.
What you had to do to stay alive.
Yeah.
That.
It does remind me of Hades, which I've been playing a lot of lately.
Oh yeah, I need to get into that game because it's
I really enjoy it. The
It's-
writing is so good.
yes. I mean it. The voice acting, the writing,
Yes.
it's great.
The art. I mean, maybe we should play that on stream.
Yeah, I have it on I don't know, on Switch.
Yeah, that's what we have.
So yeah, and we do have the dock here, so I can bring that in. Maybe
yeah,
next
I
week
think
we'll
that's a
do
good
that.
idea. I'd love that.
I was just thinking how
Oh boy.
this sort of like fungus-strewn insect world with old technology stacking up must look like a lot of people's basements.
Yeah, right. Can you get up on that platform and knock some of the bombs down, or no?
Which one?
There's a small platform down there in that
Probably.
section.
What is this?
Ooh,
I don't know what that is.
Okay.
it's like Lost.
Oh,
Yeah.
Whee!
Look at
It
that.
is a bunker.
It is like Lost.
Download to get away from the car. It didn't work.
There's always a bunker in the post-apocalyptic world. Is there anything down here? I love the narrator's voice in this. It's hilarious.
Well, it reminds me of Gauntlet.
Yeah,
That's
oh, I
true.
love
Yeah,
Gauntlet.
I didn't even think
I
about
played
that.
that in my when I was in college. They had a very small arcade in the basement of the Union where we would freshman union at Harvard, and they had Gauntlet my freshman year,
Nice.
and we spent so much money playing that game.
Well, it was.
Blue Valkyrie needs food badly.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was such a great formula for cooperative play.
Yeah, I mean cooperative play was so rare at that point in a cabinet, in an arcade game.
I played a later version ported onto the PS2.
Oh, I see.
I didn't have that
I've never played the ported version.
point, but I actually what's it called? Upshots. I played the cabinet version of.
So you did get to see it.
I did get to
Gauntlet?
see it,
Oh,
yes,
that's good.
and the way that all the
All the
panel,
different, there's
they're all
four
at
different sections,
colors,
and
yeah.
the color coding and all the rest. Man, that was somebody needs to write a book chapter about that game. So. Just to satisfy my own nostalgia.
I know what you mean because in that anthology book, How to Study Video Games, there's a chapter about Age of Empires and RTS games and shallow recreations of colonialism. But it certainly satisfied my own nostalgia for playing that growing up. You know?
Yeah, it's really. I mean, there's such a lack of scholarship about a lot of games that it's, even if you don't agree with an article or think it's kind of a shallow examination of it, and I'm not saying that one is, it's just satisfying to sort of see it. Like,
Right, and that's an important principle of scholarship we can sometimes forget, which we tend to remember in anthropology because so many people have written ethnographies that aren't necessarily deep, or moving the conceptual ball forward, but which are valuable because they were written. They give us access to some level of a moment in time of a particular context, and that's true of any study of media as well.
I'm thinking about the actually normally an anthropologist. I think of Nepal, who did a book about chess. Anthropologist, the chessboard.
Oh, yes, I've seen that book. I haven't read it.
This which is a passion ethnography, because normally he writes about all this other more canonical stuff.
Yeah.
But being an active chess player himself.
Yeah, that those passion projects should be more legitimated, and I think they will be, because we're kind of shedding that high modernist notion of academia as an only valid project is one that conforms to all the classical, kind of armchair or high-minded or colonial standards. We had here at UWM the anthropologist Bill Washabaugh, who was an anthropologist of Spain, had written about flamenco and performance and things. But later in his career, he wrote ethnography / memoir of trout fishing, because he was a dedicated trout fisher, right? Yeah. And so many people were ready to completely dismiss the book because of his own passionate relationship to that activity. And I always thought that was a real shame, It was categorically dismissed, rather than looked to for what it did contribute. Well, that's a cool buff.
So you were saying a part of this is that you can get different mutations.
Yeah, so I have 2 mutations now. I'm gonna die though, but then it breaks. Yeah, I am never good at roguelikes.
One of the things that's really satisfying about Hades, I don't know if this game has that mechanic, but you invest the time slowly and in a fun, non-linear way, you do get better.
Yeah.
Right? You get powered up.
Yes.
So you get credentials that can stand in for your competence.
Yes. And you are constantly getting new story beats from it.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, they had that kind of system in Oblivion, but they took it away for Skyrim.
I can't believe I didn't play Oblivion, because I was a pretty dedicated Elder Scrolls player back to the days of Daggerfall, but I never played Oblivion.
Oblivion, I feel like it's kind of a middle game between, like, Skyrim is so huge, and a kind of a disappointment to me. And Oblivion, I mean, it certainly was popular at the time, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to have captured the same kind of dedicated fan base as Skyrim, or even Morrowind, which has a more like, this was such a weird game. It's
Right, yeah.
And I stopped playing Morrowind about 20, 30 levels in, primarily because I found the landscape so dreary, actually.
Yeah, well, and that was kind of my problem with Skyrim. I mean, it's all, snow for the most part, and it's just
At
kind
least you have a bright blue sky.
True.
Yeah, Oblivion sort of, I think, because Morrowind was so, you can say, alternative from sort of fantasy land, Oblivion returned to the kind of the Middle England Thames Valley idea of Fantasyland, because they had the Oblivion Gates which when you went through were so utterly despairing. In fact, such despairing environments you didn't want to spend any longer in than you had to.
Right. So I guess it betrays my colonialist commitments if I preferred Skyrim to Morrowind, right?
I don't know what that
I'm a
means.
child of J.R.R. Tolkien.
I was just reading an essay about Tom Bombadil.
Oh, really?
And about how somebody's idea of, because some of my friends have on Facebook, they translated or they digitized a handwritten essay by a Tolkien scholar, and the basic premise was that Tom Bombadil doesn't fit into Middle Earth because Tom Bombadil represents something about England in the way that it never fit into wider European context. And actually, when we were talking about law before, one of the ways in which England never fit into Europe was the fact that they had a much more idiosyncratic legal system, which even Scotland from the 8th century was thinking about law in a comparative context with Roman and French law.
Absolutely.
Scottish scholars.
And J.R.R. Tolkien had very strong feelings about all of this stuff. He was, those ideas are both partly about an autochthony, right? A relationship with a landscape and a claim about a deep historical association with the landscape, but also a set of ideas about language.
Sure.
And Tolkien was quite famously, he despised French importations into English.
Sure.
Like cul-de-sac. He hated that. So Bag End is in fact cul-de-sac.
Oh, really?
In a
that makes sense.
English form, right? So I think that idea, that analysis that Tom Bombadil represents that kind of the England that stands for something, that wants to hold away all these external influences and have its domain. I think that's a very smart move to make, for sure.
The Upper Thames Valley area.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Tolkien was always English, never British.
Right.
For exactly that reason, because he was rooted to the earth as much as a tree.
My advisor, Michael Hertzfeld, used to like to talk about how his parents, who came to England from Germany because of Nazism in the late 30s, would insistently tell Michael, "We are not English, we are British." And on that note, I have to go, folks, but thanks so much.
Okay, well, it's good to see you.
Yeah, hopefully you can come next week for, we'll say, Hades. Whoops.
I'd love that.
So you're fighting the boss now?
Yeah, with not a lot of life here.
Maxotor. Interesting. Right, cheerio.
I find without like a long-range weapon, these bosses are really hard. Thankfully, I have one.
You got this arm frisbee.
Yeah. Oh, oh, that was close. This is about the time in a fight that I get sloppy. So I'm like, I'm gonna do it. There we go. What's this? Heart up. Well, can I get some hearts? That'll do. Alright.
So have you managed to infer any more of the narrative here? Or?
No. Loading. I think I've gotten to this world once. As I said, I'm not very good at this game. Thomas contributes such a spirited discussion. Oh no! That you almost have to take a couple minutes to recalibrate yourself.
Right, yeah. I'm trying to think of that game. That it's sort of another post-apocalyptic game, and one of the interesting things about it is all the weapons are completely randomized.
Okay.
And
Borderlands?
yes,
Yeah.
Borderlands.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, well, and that's, speaking of Gauntlet, that's very much sort of the similar genre to that, in that I believe I've never played in multiplayer, which is unfortunate because it really is a multiplayer game. Like, it really wants you to play with other people, but the different players all have different types, and you can only have one of each of those players on a team. And I believe there's 4 even, so it's very Gauntlet-esque. But yeah, that has a similar thing where, I mean, it's not a roguelike, because the levels are pre-designed, but you always get these weird weapons that have different characteristics that are randomized in it.
for sure.
Oh, I'm really making the dough here.
A lot of these cavern fiends are
Mm-hmm.
really into music.
Yeah, they had all those mixtapes that they.
This
they
is
had in their
something I've
pocket.
always find interesting about games that ultimately derive from D&D.
Mm-hmm.
Is when you make wealth accumulation a form of a measure of progress,
Mm-hmm.
how it ultimately creates a necessity to explain away why a larval fish in a subterranean cave has 6 gold pieces on
Yeah.
it,
Yeah. I think, and some games kind of try to change that narrative a bit. They'll have, you don't actually get any gold from like a bear that you killed, but you'll get bear parts that you can sell.
Right, yeah. Totally.
And I mean, it's all kind of. I mean, everything is just points, really, in those games, and that's just another sort of capital system in them.
Sure.
So, which, whatever, that's fine. I just think it's interesting because that's such a convention that you really can't get away from it. Because if you, and there has to be rewards in those games. Otherwise, you have no
Incentive?
incentive. Yes, thank you, to fight. Like if you just kill a bear and that's it.
Right, yeah.
You're not going to go out there.
But yeah, by having them drop loot,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes an end in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Which,
It's a reward, Oh boy.
oh,
That looks mean.
I was also thinking about these rush attacks, where the creature, also the Maxator, was doing this as well. Rushing, and I was thinking about how I could replicate that in my D&D game. But the issue is, because it's not a persistent environment, there is no way to, on a turn-by-turn basis, make that a challenge, because it's in the real-time reaction to the sudden burst of pace.
Yes, yeah.
That it becomes a...
Armoring Legion. Ooh. Alright, now how the heck do I get out of here? Alright. This is the best I've done in the game. We're almost out of time. Yeah, but I think that those different types of attack are... Well, it's kind of borrowed from arcade games, really, but it's been integrated into some RPG games. But, you know, there's such a... Like, that purity of genre really doesn't exist in the RPGs anymore. Whereas before it was like, oh, okay, well, it's turn-based combat. You know, that's not true anymore. So it's kind of weird what defines RPG, you know, and it's certainly not picking a role, because that would disqualify a lot of things that are determined to be RPGs.
Right, yeah. So, if we are running out of time, then final thoughts.
Oh, we're not that running out of time. We've still got like 9 minutes left. But if you want to do any final thoughts, I'm game.
Right, okay, good. So we've spoken about retro future apocalypse as a kind of hauntology, which I think was it Mark Fisher's term?
Well, originally it was Derrida, but yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But no, I mean, it has been co-opted for something very different, and it's actually in music, pop music too, which is interesting. But yeah, I definitely think retrofuturism applies to it.
Because it's interesting to think of the distinct fantasy worlds that generational aesthetics create, which complicates a relationship to the future for people in those subject positions, you know, and you know, like the relationship between this era and science fiction movies like, I don't know, Tron, you know, the ways in which, like, transcending the material in a time when people were still frustratingly locked in I don't know. So anyway, these distinct decade by decade aesthetics and things extend when you're living them in the present moment, rather than looking back on them like through a 8 CD collection of music of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s or whatever. When you're living it from a present moment, they all inform certain ways of imagining the future. But because they're ultimately tied to processes of consumerism, just like any other market, those aesthetics saturate, so that you have to then imagine a new kind of present, a new kind of promise for the future. Which means that, well, what happens to the one that was before? What happens to when you're living in the 80s and people are imagining the future in a certain way? What happened to the promises of the 70s
or the 50s,
right? With the atomic sort of utopianism that we find in the Fallout games and stuff. And so it's interesting to think of them as these sorts of games which take that aesthetic and play it out into an apocalyptic future as a kind of alternate reality, or maybe an extension of what hauntology, as I understand it, is the ghost of futures that never came to be. Yeah.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
And I don't know.
Is there? I wonder. Is there a retro fantasy aesthetic? I don't know. I mean,
yeah, old school Renaissance. No.
How so? I mean, how that's.
Right. Well, you know, this sort of Gygaxian fantasy is more dangerous than 5th edition, 4th edition. It's less ego-centered.
Okay.
And the idea that the heroes are simply the zero-level peasants that don't die, as opposed to contemporary editions where every player comes into the game with a character concept. Tacitly, it's understood that players' characters aren't going to die, and so they invest in their characters, all of these biographies and things.
Okay.
Whereas old school D&D is much more centered around the contingencies of the dice
Okay.
and the dangers inherent in that, so that you might have 4 or 5 characters before you learn the shape of the system, before you learn how to survive within those sorts of mechanics.
Okay.
And so the aesthetic that accompanies that, you know, there's a good paper actually that looks at comparing the aesthetics of old and new RPG systems as well as the mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And the way, if you look at the art styles of these older RPG systems, heroes are often represented as quite wiry and weak,
Okay.
wearing armor that looks quite clunky, mismatched, too big for them, struggling to lift swords, for example.
Okay.
Whereas you can then compare that with the Dragonborn Paladin of like 4th edition, or the Aarakocras of 5th edition or whatever, which you know, characters which are always wearing very well tailored clothing. They're always they're wearing all sorts of fine fabrics, and they're very strong and usually quite muscular. You know, and so that's really the contrast in aesthetics there, which is
Okay.
reflective of the I'd say like the ethos and mechanics of the different systems.
So, do you find that there are some... Is there a hauntology, again, to some players going back to the original editions of Dungeons and Dragons? Just like there's a hauntology to
Right, yeah.
retrofuturism?
Well, it's interesting because... Well, yeah, I suppose. I mean, these are... the thing about it is these aren't just aesthetic choices. That because they're interlinked
mechanic.
with the mechanical
Yeah.
thing as well, it really becomes about the game you're playing. You
Yeah.
know, like if you elect to play Advanced 2nd Edition, then you're electing to play a kind of aesthetic, which an aesthetic which is reflective of the descriptions,
Yeah.
which is reflective of the mechanics.
Yeah.
I don't know if I posit such an order of those sorts of domains. And what's distinctive from that to science fiction is that you don't necessarily have that same causal relationship. But then, you know, to move away from D&D and to talk about fantasy in itself, then, you know, I feel like then you're saying, well, does fantasy constantly reinvent itself?
I think that's kind of what would need to be evaluated. And I mean, it doesn't, you know, and in order for it to be a hauntology, it would have to, you know, it would almost have to, well, if we view fantasy as being somewhat informed with our conceptions of the past, or at least our mythology to a certain extent, then it would have to maybe ignore certain discoveries about mythology, which is hard to do. I mean, because newer fantasy doesn't necessarily have to take into account those newer discoveries. It's not reflective of a real period, you know.
No, but always an imagined past, which in some way, some critics would say props up the inequities of the present, you know.
Yeah.
In imagining a past, or even a thinly veiled past in the fantasy realm, which is a sort of overbloomed European sort of situation, then it doesn't really do much to... And so maybe the ways in which fantasy reinvents itself is to be more accurate to the wider experiences of the past within a global audience. You know, there's a real play D&D stream called The Fourth Culture,
Okay.
which is based in Singapore. And a lot of what they do is to try and constitute a new fantastic center based in Far East.
Okay. Yeah.
Or Polynesian sort of, not Polynesian, well, a Far East or Southeast kind of fantasy
Yeah.
or myth and that sort of thing. And of course, because why should people who don't but then you have a sort of fantasy, not a fantasy nationalism, but a sort of idea about, you know, well, what kinds of fantasies are inclusive, of course.
Right.
But then what sorts of fantasies are appropriate as well?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, like the whole issue in fantasy of subhumanoids
Mm-hmm.
completely smacks of social evolutionary theory of like 19th century European anthropologists.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the idea that the world is full of monsters who have sort of quasi-tribal levels of society,
Mm-hmm.
and that they are in some way less advanced or civilized than the heroes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I still even remember the description of 4th edition D&D, where it's like, this world is, you know, think of civilization as a collection of lights in the darkness.
Right.
You know, and this wider darkness being filled with quasi-tribal subhumanoids.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's difficult to, just like explaining why a tiger is dropping gold coins,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes difficult to explain away why this sort of cultural representation of fantastic monsters, you know, as sort of here be dragons, edge of the map, meeting notions of savagery.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
So to bring it back to that then, the hauntology of fantasy...
It's almost kind of built in some ways.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, it is past 1 o'clock.
Right, okay, good.
So,
Well, this has been another thrilling lunch zone. An oomph zone. And with the Omicron strain, I'm sure we will continue to oomph for months to come.
Yes.
But thank you, Nathan, for bringing another exciting game for us
Alright.
to analyze and dissect. And
yeah.
we'll look forward to next week.
Yep. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.